Hello everyone, I'm Maya, and today I will talk about Bulgarian film distribution and exhibition through the memories of different generations of spectators. This project is funded by the British Academy and it takes place at Oxford Brookes University. So, before I begin, I'll give you a bit of a context for the project, a few words on film culture, generations and memories. Then I will look at the memories of different generations through the aspects of film programming, texts, access, censorship, sociability and repeat viewing, the different media and venues involved. And I will draw some conclusions on the lived experiences of shifts, continuities and disruptions in distribution exhibition, and the theoretical implications. Please bear in mind I am not a film historian or a memory studies scholar, so I do appreciate your feedback. A word on my project: it's a 3.5-year postdoctoral project which aims to investigate the habits and preferences of contemporary Bulgarian film audiences in relation to new Bulgarian cinema as well, and also their ability to access audiovisual products. It stems from a relative lack of systematic academic research into the field, and it hopes to facilitate dialogue with producers, distributors, and exhibitors. In terms of methodology, I've used a mixed model study combining parallel qualitative and quantitative approaches. I subscribe under Schroeder et al.'s methodological pluralism and discursive realism. I triangulate data sources, theories, and methods, and my participants are recruited through convenience sampling, meaning that they are volunteers, which I'll address in a second. The questions have been adapted from the UK Film Council Cultural Contribution Film Questionnaire, the Mercedes Questionnaire, and the European Cinema Audiences Project. In terms of sample obtained, I have 580 valid responses for my survey questionnaire and 86 focus group or interview respondents, and I will be focusing a bit more on the qualitative side of the study and the focus group and interviews which took place in the 14 different settlements across the country. My sample is a bit skewed towards women, the younger generation, and people coming from medium and large towns. However, they are all quite interested in film and cinema. Now, I'm not saying that that means that all of the people who are interested in film are my participants, but it still makes for a very interesting sample and interesting plethora of opinions. I have to say that the gender imbalance might stem from my own demographic background, or having spoken to people anecdotally and having looked at some other studies on gendered hobbies, it might be something of a perception. Who knows? And there's definitely room for more exploration there. Now, I would like to also point out that in terms of cinema going, the National Statistical Institute presents data which shows that there's an even balance between male and female cinema goers. But if you also look at the age differences, the older the respondents are, the less frequently they go to the cinema. And it's important to note that in my study I don't equate cinema going to film viewing in general, because I want to be quite inclusive with people's practices and preferences. My participants have reported on their film viewing habits. In 2018, obviously prior to the pandemic, they would watch films on TV daily. They would use illegal services such as torrents or free streaming weekly, and they would go to the cinema monthly. So it is quite important to acknowledge how film viewing has changed across all the different generations currently. As I said before, I'm not trying to be representative or exhaustive when I look at Bulgarian film audiences, but this is more of an exploratory and inclusive survey, which looks at the lived experiences of film viewing. I am influenced by Ian Christie's work and his observations that film viewing, irrespective of platform, has increased and become more domesticated through TV and beyond. Technology's mediums offering spaces and places change and have been changing, so I am interested to see how audience segments have been navigating the spectrum of opportunities, challenges, and choices when engaging with film. Now, I don't need to convince you in the value of studying cinema and film culture, but please be aware that this study is contextualized within the work of Annette Kuhn, who explains that cinema culture is shaped by the context and the manner in which films are consumed and by the people who consume them, by Daniele Treveri Gennari's observations that beyond programming there's also the multisensory aesthetics of perceiving the projected image, interactions with spectators, intentions, expectations, performances of certain social roles. Elise van der Vishver very usefully summarizes this as the social conditions and cultural practices which are vital for the experience of cinema, and are thus theoretically and historiographically inseparable from it. And of course, the new cinema history movement, here summarized by Richard Mulby, who talks about questions of circulation, agency, brokerage, experience of cinema rather than the apparatus, and the heterogeneity and social construction of cinema audiences. When it comes to film and memory, again, I am quite influenced by Annette Kuhn and her separation of different types of film memories as discursive, thematic, and experiential. So we've got type A memories, which are very text-based, very image-based, very fragmented. We have type B memories, which are situated, anecdotal, and linked to the respondent's personal experiences in life. And then type C memories, which are generally social, collective, repetitive, and they talk about the everyday social experience of cinema scenes. Now, having said all of this, I would also like to add in my exploration the place of the medium as structuring and influencing those film viewing experiences as well. And a quick word on generations. The idea of how generations are formed has moved from Meinham's conceptualization of generations as social phenomenon demarcated by class, socio-political temporality, and comprising of smaller units. And Arrow explains that such generations have vertical as well as horizontal implications, so you have intergenerational dialogue, but you also have the horizontal groupings of generations according to their contemporaneity. And then more recently we've looked at generationality, which is more of a zeitgeist-dependent construct, collectively claimed by members of the same generational group, but also assigned to them from the outside to reduce complexity. Generational differentiation is marked by generational identities which often overlapped with the rise of new social-political movements, and it's assumed that the formative period for a generation is between the ages of 17 and 25, although of course there is an influence on childhood experiences as well. Memory and generation. Now, memory is a very important locus for reflection on the connection between time and generations, and it serves to embody and reconstruct the experience of such time in social settings. So memories represent a future and present and structure social time for particular generations. There is value in an interdisciplinary approach to generations, so as Roelke has mentioned, more attention to historical phenomenon of perception, experience, and memory, but of course we need to maintain a critical stance and keep in mind that memories are interpretative and discursive. The act of remembering can serve to define, construct the generational norm, and often trigger collective individual nostalgia. Generations and film. Now, as Kuhn points out, cinema memory does relate quite explicitly to the historically and generationally situated or specific experience, even if there are some universal and archetypal qualities. Alan, interviewed for Mopey and Mears, talks about the need to have more zoomable historiographies and the ability to compare sets of practices across film viewing generations. And there has been work in media and generations and the effects that generations and media consumption cultures have on each other in structural terms. Now, having said all of this, there's not a lot of cross-generational academic film qualitative audience research, and you know I'm giving all of those qualifiers to tell you that my work is different and original, but bear with me. So most of the film research which relates to generations is quantitative. It's done by consulting firms such as Deloitte, and it seeks to find a way to usually bring younger generations into audiences and to appeal to them, in cinemas, and to appeal to them and to monetize their interest and activities. There's also quite a lot of research on media generations, focusing particular on different use of media and TV, social media, music. There is of course work in memory studies, projects at De Montfort University, at Oxford Books, the Brno Film Culture Project, 1960s British cinema going, Jacqueline Meingard's work on South African film histories and cinema-going memories, and on Flanders youth and contemporary film consumption preferences. All of those projects are focused on particular generations or one particular generation, and of course we have these cinema city cultures, which is the umbrella term for lots of different projects, and they do have a slight more diversity, but again, most of those projects compare across geographical localities and not so much across generations. There are two very notable examples in this. It's a book chapter by Lies van der Vuscher and the work of Jana Jones, and they both compare young people's experiences. Lies focuses on the social motivations for contemporary cinema goers, and Jana Jones looks at her students' film viewing and early memories and film viewing experiences and compares them to memory work done on other projects with different generations. How do I categorize my Bulgarian film viewers? I look at some socio-political and cultural factors. The years born for my film viewer generations are not set in stone, but I have actually tried to do a mixture of bottom-up and top-down, so looking at some of the factors that structure particular generations, but also looking at similarities between their memories, so that I make sure that they are in the correct group when I discuss their experiences. So the first group is the slightly older generation who experienced the transition to communism, the beginnings of industrialization, and the build-up of the nationalized film industry. Then we have the middle generation, which grew up in a period of intense urbanization as a result of manufacturing being established as the main industry in Bulgaria. Of course, there was ideological propaganda and political oppression, very strong censorship apparatus, but it was also the growth of the domestic film industry and the first establishment and gradual growth of TV as well. Finally, we have the youngest generation, which my project captures, These are the people who grew up during the end of communism and the transition to democracy, where the vertically integrated film industry was dismantled and there was quite a substantial loss of infrastructure and audiences in Bulgaria. So there were the rise of alternative technologies and alternative places to consume film. And importantly, in the late 90s and early 90s, there was some film legislation which helped with the development of the sector as well. Finally, we have the younger generation, which will not be part of this project, but they are growing up and have grown up in the period where Bulgaria has already joined the EU. There's been a rise of multiplex screens, more interest in locally produced content, but still quite a strong influence of Hollywood. And so I will be focusing on the first three generations for this project. I also want to make sure that the categorization which I have proposed is not mutually exclusive with what has been used in Western sociological surveys. I just think that it's important to adopt a more local lens when dealing with very particular local developments and trying to look at particular generational groups' responses to them. Now, one of the most important things that structures the experience of viewers is the rise and subsequent dismantlement of the exhibition cinema network. As my colleague Alexander Donov speculates, perhaps it is the generation which is growing up right now which will have more of a taste towards different types of films because they'll have more of an opportunity to watch films in cinemas as compared to the generation who grew up in the second half of the 90s and beginning of the new century. I'm not sure to what extent this analysis corresponds to the actual lived and formative experiences, and how different that generation really is compared to the other ones. And so this is what I will be focusing on for the rest of this presentation. So looking at experiences of programming and texts, we see that the older generation was quite influenced by the abundance of Russian programming, especially between 1953 and 1958, but they also talk a lot about Indian films, about French films, and a plethora of other film nationalities. We have Petya from Sofia, who remembers seeing Bulgarian crime films as one of her earliest memories, and Mirella, whose grandmother took her to see The Thief of Baghdad, a UK production, where she remembers a scene with a huge spider. And again, we've got this type A experience, which is very embodied. She doesn't remember anything else of the film. It scared her so much. But she also later on went to see a film with her father, which was based on the Bulgarian liberation of Ottoman domination and the battles at the Shipka Peak. So she was also quite impressed by Russian children's films. Again, The Stone Flower comes up, Little Silver Hoof. Then we have the middle generation. Prolet from Kazanlak remembers Indian films and again has this embodied experience of reacting to a snake zigzagging across the screen. Vasilena remembers having regular film screenings twice a day in the village where she would spend the summers near her hometown of Haskovo, and how a different film reel arrived every day. So she had a very diverse cultural offer, both in that little village where she grew up and in the town of Haskovo, where later on there were 3 or 4 different cinema theatres with varied programming. Trojana from Plovdiv remembers what she lovingly calls the cowboy spaghetti western films, films from the socialist bloc, and again Russian titles. Temenushka, one of the younger respondents, actually saw quite an old film in the town of Botovgrad, The Kid, when she was year 3 or 4. And then we have the youngest generation whose memories are dominated by Hollywood and Disney. We have Ilka remembering The Lion King, where her dad took her. She couldn't read. He promised to read to her quietly and he fell asleep. We have Asen, who was 17 at the time, remembered being the last generation which grew up with Komsomol Cinema, a standalone cinema in Stara Zagora, which later closed down. But he also remembers a Hollywood film, The Incredibles, and Eftimia, who remembers Journey to the Center of the Earth. It is no surprise, looking at the data from programming, that Hollywood has taken over. If you see, it used to be a very small percentage of the feature film releases in the 1960s, and gradually, especially with the transition to democracy, as you see the films in the chart in yellow, that is the share of American films on Bulgarian screens gradually taking over in the early 90s and beyond. In terms of access and censorship, both Chavdar and Angelina remember their experience of All That Jazz, which they were surprised managed to avoid censorship. Of course, Angelina remembers that there was only one screening of that film, and same as Hair, she was lucky to catch that one screening, but then it was taken down. And Raina from Kalofer remembers that because she went to study in Sofia and because her aunt was working for the Filmmakers Club, she enjoyed the relative intellectual freedom of attending screenings which were otherwise not available in the rest of the countries. Kamen from Kazanlak remembers going to the cinema video clubs, which were part private, part public enterprises towards the end of communism in Bulgaria, where they would play VHS cassettes and you would be able, on a TV screen, and you would be able to order beverages and food, but they would screen films that were not allowed in cinemas, such as The Godfather, which he saw in his university town of Gabrovo. And moving over to VHS cassettes, for women that was the best way to access new films in the early 90s, and those cassettes were of course pirated because the original ones were not available for sale. And jumping forward a few years, Vera had to learn how to use and read DVDs because the videotheque of near where she grew up closed down, so her brother was illegally recording some DVDs with children's films for her. Sociability and repeat viewing have been divorced in discussing sometimes different generations and their practices, but what I try to show here is that there were levels of social experience as well as repeat viewing across the different generations, as we see with Chavdar, who went with his friends to see Sandokan, the ruler of the seas, repeatedly so that they could learn all the lines and they could reenact swashbuckling. And then we've got Mladen, who went to the cinema exclusively with his friends when he was studying in the town of Pazarjik. Then we also have Zina's experience of not only having a social viewing of the Bulgarian film Under the Yoke, but also provoking all of the members of the audience to start throwing fruit and vegetables at the screen when the villain appeared. And then we have Zorka, who was one of the few to address courtship rituals related to cinema going, how you go to the cinema with your boyfriend, how your mother or one of her colleagues might be lurking around to see if you're holding hands. And Zahari from Botivgrad, from the youngest generation, who discussed the instrumentality of his brother introducing him to different VHS cassettes of Hollywood films, taking him to the cinema as well. Sveti remembers going illegally, cutting through the wire of the open-air cinema in the town of Sozopol, so she and her friends from the neighborhood could repeatedly watch Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and Labyrinth. Dima, who is again from the younger generation, who was obsessed with Snow White and would rent all sorts of VHS cassettes from the local videotheque and make her parents watch them with her. And Damiana, who is still quite obsessed with Ice Age and watches it alone or with her parents and friends at home all the time. In terms of medium and venues, we have one of the older respondents who remembers watching a film at home on a cinema projector when he was about 5 years old, and later on going to the cinema. So for him, the first experience of film was actually in a domestic environment. And then we have the semi-formal screenings, which took place across schools, across military service grounds, as well as organized through different institutions. For example, as is Greta's memory, through the orphanage where her parents were working. Of course, we have memories of TV viewing. Sorka, who remembers having a German TV set, brand Stadium, which needed to be hit on the side so that it stops flickering. And Evelina, who remembers a cult film or TV series film every kilometer, which all the neighborhood would get together and watch collectively, because not everyone had a TV set at the time. A similar experience by Leda, where her family actually owned a TV set and the whole neighborhood would come and visit and watch the German The Green Monster. They would even bring offerings of a wood log during the winter so that they could keep warm on the stove. And Natalia, who doesn't remember film viewing on TV but remembers going to the cinema and actually not being particularly comfortable because the seats were wooden. Which leads us to Nadezhda's experience of a very formal cinema environment where her parents are wearing formal clothes, it's quiet, it's dark, you're not allowed to move, the chairs are not very comfortable, there's no air conditioning, and you don't quite know what's happening. And this is contrasted with her being slightly older and quite fascinated by the film projection equipment. Then we have Roman from the younger generation, who was equally fascinated by and overwhelmed by the cinema experience, the screen, the sound, the hand-painted posters for Titanic. And that's contrasted with Yanica, who grew up watching films on TV, in particular Bulgarian films. Finally, we have the youngest generation, who would see Jackie Chan films with her family on a laptop connected to the TV, and Albena, who went to the cinema, but she remembers the casualness of it. That was probably before the multiplexes, because now in the multiplexes, as she says, there's the constant announcement, don't litter, make sure you take all of your rubbish with you, which she thinks spoiled the casual environment. Some zeitgeist titles which have come up in all of the film memories, quite a lot of Bulgarian titles across the different generations. Of course, films from the Eastern Bloc, All That Jazz, and other films which managed to avoid censorship. We also have a TV series like Verano Azul, which was Blue Summer, which was very popular with respondents in the middle generation. Russian cartoons like Nu Pogodi, and of course the Bulgarian at every kilometer, which was very formative for the middle generation of respondents. And the younger generation has been particularly affected by Hollywood and Disney programming, which is very prominent and unavoidable on formal and informal screens alike. Some preliminary conclusions. As already noted, the spectrum of cinema memories includes both memories of film texts intermingled with memories of personal experiences, sociality and technology. So it's difficult to differentiate very clearly between type A, B and C memories sometimes. Film distribution and exhibition, in Bulgaria in particular, have been shared between the realms of the private and the public across the different generations. There has been a love for cinema going in film that isn't generationally coded, and neither is the influence and convenience of the small screen and home viewing. New expectations of a more casual cinema environment for the younger generation might be forming based on watching more films at home and on TV. But there's the importance of locality and temporality in shaping perceptions and experiences of accessibility and cultural offer, what cinemas are open in which towns, for how long, and how formative that is for particular generations. I think there needs to be, more generally, further attention paid to avoiding purifying film memories of formative experiences that don't fit the classical definition of cinema going. And perhaps there is room to expand new cinema history into a more inclusive of different types of experiences, new film history. Thank you.